one person.
I'll be here once in a while.
Yeah, once in a while. I pretty much know everybody in this room by name at this point. So I probably don't need to do the full commercial, because I think you all know it. But welcome to the museum. As always, the list of upcoming events is out on the table. The next our big one, of course, is the Ghost Army event, and I believe everybody here has, most of you have tickets already. So if you please spread the word. We need to sell, I think, 9 more tickets to get to the break-even point.
Oh, cool.
So
That's not bad.
we're close. And we've decided that the money that we raise from that event is going to go towards upgrading our collection software, because the program that we're using is no longer supported and we're having some issues with it. So, and Past Perfect has now come up with a wonderful cloud-based one that we can, so that we can pretty much work on the database from anywhere with that system. But unfortunately, you have to buy it / lease it, so it's going to cost. So whatever we make from that Ghost Army event is going towards getting some new software for the museum. So tell everybody to buy a ticket so we can afford some new software. So I guess without any further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Szilagyi. He's going to talk to us about the Great Lakes Carriers.
Hello everybody, glad to see that you guys can make it on a beautiful fall day, so I understand why it's a little light today, but just to kind of let you guys know who I am, my name is Jason Szilagyi. I'm a professor of history at Central Michigan University and also at Delta College. For Delta College, I teach a lot of their U.S. history and Michigan history courses, and for Central Michigan University, I teach pretty much all of their Middle Eastern courses. I'm their Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies advisor, so a little bit of everything. But Chris heard one of our podcasts. We do History with the Szilagys. It's a twice-a-week podcast that we put out, my wife and I, Christina. And we did one on aircraft carriers operating the Great Lakes during the Second World War. And Chris heard it, it's like, hey, just come down and go through here. So what we're going to do is briefly kind of give a history as to why we needed aircraft carriers in the Great Lakes, what ships were converted over, and then what ultimately ended up happening with them. So there are 2 civilian liners, passenger liners, that get converted to aircraft carriers between 1942 and 1943, the Sable and the Wolverine. And these are going to operate out of Chicago. Okay, basically, there's a naval base there that we're going to talk about. And this is to give pilots the opportunity to train on how to take off and land on aircraft carriers. The reasons will be coming up in a second. But this is actually one of them. This is actually the Wolverine. Okay, and that one originally operated out of Detroit. One of the things that ends up happening between World War I and World War II is that naval strategy and naval weapons are starting to change. Instead of relying just on heavier surface warships, like battleships and cruisers, aircraft carriers had started to be developed at the very end of the First World War, designed mostly for reconnaissance. Okay, to find an enemy fleet and observe where it's at, so the battleships would come in and destroy it if they needed to. During the 30s, though, that principle started to change. And instead of just being reconnaissance platforms, they started to become strike platforms as well. The idea that you could attack over the horizon, okay, without actually having to engage enemy surface ships as you go through. And so there's an expansion of aircraft carriers that are being built around the world. The United States, Britain, and Japan are the leading countries that are putting together these carrier strike groups as they go through. Depending on what their strategies are, the aircraft carriers are kind of designed differently. For the British, they were looking at more along the lines of having their ships protected, so what they do is they have armored decks and armored hangar bays. It limits the number of aircraft that they can have, but they're a little bit better off when it comes to being attacked by enemy aircraft if it's bombing. Americans and Japanese, we decided to do wooden flight decks and unarmored hangar bays. And that way we have increased capacity in order to have more aircraft, fighters and strike craft. Difficulty with this is the fact that if your flight deck is damaged, there's a chance that it's going to be non-operational until you get to a port in order to fix it.
So how many planes fit on there?
In general, okay, this is one of the Essex class carriers, so it's one of the large fleet carriers, one of the really big ones that's developed in 42 and 43. So you're looking at, with the US, we're pushing to have anywhere between 85 and 97 aircraft.
Wow.
Because you have some on deck, but for the most part you have a hangar that's going to be underneath with elevators that will lower, okay, and raise planes for maintenance. You usually arm them on the deck. And you have a combination of fighter aircraft, okay, to either act as escorts for your strike group. You always keep some behind to fly what would be considered a combat air patrol, which is fighter sorties that are around the fleet to intercept enemy aircraft. You would have torpedo bombers, which basically would be ones that could either carry a torpedo to attack warships, or they could carry conventional bombs. And then you have the more specialized dive bombers. And those are for either surface attack, to go after enemy warships, or to strike enemy targets on land. And so there's a fine balance of how many of each type of aircraft you can have on board the ships. And just because, you know, there's 85 or 95 of them, doesn't mean they're all going at the same time. A lot of times they're going out either in smaller groups to act as combat air patrol or reconnaissance. In some cases, they are under maintenance, so you don't necessarily have your full strike group as you go in. With the aircraft carriers too, they're designed different than other surface warships. For the most part, the only armament that they will have is anti-aircraft weapons. You can see, okay, one of that guns here, okay, usually 5-inch guns, and then you have 40 millimeter, 20 millimeter, and 50 caliber machine guns set up along the sides, okay, and towards the back of the ship. The aircraft carriers really rely on their aircraft and their escorting surface ships in order to protect them. Beyond that, they, you know, other than their aircraft, they're really kind of vulnerable if they get caught out in the open. And so, with the United States during the Great Depression, those naval budgets kind of got constricted. Okay, it was more along the lines of preserving the ships that we had instead of developing new ones or building new ones. So what ends up happening is that you have the first batch of aircraft carriers that are built in the late 20s, early 30s, but then there's a bunch of different designs that are on the drawing boards. It's just they don't have the funding for it. The Essex is going to be, Essex class carriers are one of those where they're the large carriers with the largest carrying capacity for the war. You'll also have light aircraft carriers, which are smaller versions of aircraft carriers. Instead of being purposely designed as aircraft carriers, they were laid down, when the Navy starts to build them, they're laid down as light cruisers, okay, surface warships. And demand for aircraft carriers was so high that they're changed over during the construction process. And so they'll basically be aircraft carriers, but smaller versions. Okay. And then you would have escort carriers, which are merchant ships. So like oilers or freighters that are going to be converted with a landing deck on them, so that they can basically be used to protect convoys that are running between North America and Europe. Or in the Pacific, they'll cover those convoys as well. So once President Franklin Roosevelt realizes that the war is coming to the United States, what he starts to do in 1939, 1940, 1941 is that he is pushing Congress to start putting through bills that will be naval acquisition funds or army acquisition funds, so that they could start the process of laying these ships down and start building these airplanes, because it's going to take a long time to get some of these industries into war mode. So he's basically, what he was doing was he was prepping the United States for war. He knew what was coming, and the idea was get the civilian production starting to shift over to war production, and that way when the United States officially enters the war, we're at least on par, and we can ramp up war production, but we don't have to go from scratch. Okay, so, let me jump back here, sorry. The United States at the beginning of World War II is not necessarily a weak power when it comes to naval aviation. The United States Navy does have a number of aircraft carriers that are already operational. It's just a small number. Okay, there's not very many to start out with. The ship that you're seeing right here, this little guy, this is the aircraft carrier Langley. Okay, this is one of the first purpose-built aircraft carriers for the U.S. Navy. The two bigger ships, okay, that are near it, that's the Saratoga and the Lexington. They had started out designed as battle cruisers for the First World War, and they're really close to being finished. And what ends up happening is Germany surrenders, World War I ends, and it's decided instead of scrapping these these partially completed ships, to convert them over to aircraft carriers instead. And so these, in the 1920s and early 1930s, these are some of the biggest aircraft carriers in the world, and some of the fastest. It's an interesting combination with them too, because where later aircraft carriers usually have just anti-aircraft weapons, what happens with these guys is that these are actually cruiser caliber guns. Okay, if they ever encountered enemy surface warships, in theory they'd be able to fend them off. They will be replaced as the war goes on though, because they find out that the shock from these is kind of too much for the bridge structure, and also kind of damages the flight deck as you go through. So, small carrier, two decent sized ones. Okay, this is the USS Enterprise. Okay, another American carrier. She has a couple of sister ships that are slightly different, the Wasp and the Hornet. When we get to here's Hornet. And then this is the Ranger. Okay, this is the final of these U.S. aircraft carriers. Where most of the U.S. aircraft carriers are based before the war is in the Pacific Theater. Ranger is stationed in the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so the U.S. Navy is basically split into two different fleets, each responsible for guarding a particular sea coast with different targets. By the time we get to 1942, the end of 1942, about the only carriers that are left, okay, are going to be the Enterprise, Saratoga, and Ranger. All the other pre-war American carriers have either been severely damaged or sunk over the course of 1941 and 42. So what ends up happening is, like in the Pacific, for a while, it's only the Enterprise against the Japanese Navy, okay, operating for a series of months like that. Ranger is in the Atlantic, and it is not switched over to the Pacific because the Ranger is covering operations that are taking place in North Africa, so they can't pull that away because that's the American airstream in that area. Hornet and Wasp, and also Yorktown, they're all sunk by the end of 42. And so what ends up happening for a while is it's just a few of these aircraft carriers fighting it out in different theaters. And what ends up happening is these become some of the most valuable ships in the U.S. Navy. Again, it's a way that we can project hitting power, but we're limited until the new ones can be built. And really, it's not until late 1942, early 1943 that these Essex-class carriers that have been ordered in 1940 and 1941, this is when they're finally starting to come online. So these are all Essex-class aircraft carriers operating in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, this is about 1944. The ships that were sunk, the American carriers that were sunk, like Hornet, Wasp, Lexington, Yorktown, they get replaced as Essex-class ships. And these will actually operate into Vietnam. Okay, some of them will be retrofitted in order to carry jet fighters, where they have another part of the flight deck added to them. The Essex class is one of the big reasons why the U.S. is able to dominate the Pacific Ocean. Once they start coming online, there's so many of them. And they're not operating as individual ships. Instead, they're operating as strike groups. So you would have anywhere from 3 to 5 of these working together, conducting strikes as you go through. This particular area right here, this is the island of Ulithi. Okay, this is an island group south of the Philippines, kind of southeast of the Philippines, that the United States takes over and then converts into this giant, basically floating shipyard. There are repair facilities there. There are spots for the sailors and airmen to actually go off ship, sit on islands for a while, rest and refit, and then go back in. And this group, okay, they're getting ready to go out, okay, and actually attack the Philippines as we go through. This is one of those light carriers. Okay, this is an Independence class light carrier. This is one of the ones that was a light cruiser that got converted to an aircraft carrier. We end up only losing one of these. None of the Essex class carriers are sunk. There are some that are severely damaged, but they're not destroyed by the Japanese. These, okay, this little kind of ugly little guy at the top, this is one of the escort carriers, one of the classes of those. So this is a merchant ship that ended up going into dry dock, or while it was being constructed, having a flight deck put on top of it. Okay, these are instrumental because having the escort carriers, okay, frees up fleet carriers and light carriers to actually attack enemy fleets and bases. These escort carriers, they're basically going with convoys, or they're going to provide strike craft to cover amphibious invasions. They're really slow. These usually can only go about 17 or 18 knots. Okay, so relatively slow. These can go up to 31 or 32 knots. These ships were designed for high speed so that they can basically get in and out of an area where they're going to be attacked, or where they're attacking before retaliation can come in. One of the interesting things with it too is that as these Essex class ships are being designed, there are classes of battleships and cruisers that are being designed with them to act as escorts. These will be fast attack strike groups. Okay, so if you've ever seen the Iowa class battleships in Missouri, New Jersey, those were designed to be escorts for these because they had the speed that could match them. When it comes to the older ships, things that, like the battleships that were at Pearl Harbor that are raised, like California and Nevada, they're too slow to operate with these. So what ends up happening is they're the ones that will provide shore fire support for the Marines and Army units in the Pacific Ocean. But, you know, building these ships is one thing. Okay, and again, each one takes years in order to lay down and build out. But then you have to train the crews. Okay, not just the people who are going to be actually operating the ship itself, but the flight crews. Okay, the groups that are going to be there to arm and refuel the aircraft, who are going to do maintenance on the aircraft. So you have to train all of them. You have to train the pilots, okay, and their weapons officers. And so, because these aircraft carriers are so limited, okay, and they are so valuable, the U.S. is not going to operate any of their real carriers as training ships. Okay, they need an alternative. And so what will happen is they turn to the Great Lakes, because the Great Lakes are a relatively safe inland waterway, okay, that can proxy conditions that would be in the Atlantic or the Pacific. So basically it's a way to train these naval aviators how to take off and land, and then it's also a spot that you can use to get the flight crews, okay, the ones who are operating the flight decks, so they can help the pilots land or take off, so that they can actually experience what it's like to arm and refuel ships, planes on a moving ship as it goes through. And again, with the United States Navy, they have, and the Army and the Marines, there are a lot of different bases that are spread throughout the United States that specialize in different areas. For the United States, a really big area that is important for training is actually in the Great Lakes. Chicago, Illinois has a naval academy there. And that is going to be an area where they train not only sailors, but also pilots, and they're also going to be responsible for training the Armed Guard and the Merchant Marines. The guys who would be on board merchant ships who operated their anti-aircraft or anti-surface weapons. And what they find is that in the Great Lakes, Okay, from 1900 until 1939, you have several relatively large passenger liner companies that are operating out of different ports. And what the Navy will do is requisition some of these ships in order to convert them into aircraft carriers. Okay. And again, because they can't take those mainline aircraft carriers out in order to train, this is going to be the thing that allows them to do it. Okay. And what ends up happening is that in early 1942, January 1942, what will be the Sable and the Wolverine, these two ships here, these had been actual operational passenger liners. So they would run from Detroit to Buffalo, New York, to Mackinac Island, to Chicago, and basically they were excursion ships, okay, passenger ships. And what happens is that the U.S. Navy buys them from those companies and then spends the next year basically taking off the top deck of the ships and then converting them so that they have a flight deck, okay, so that they have the bridge structure. Okay, so this is where the air operations and control of the ship are going to take place. And then also having to redistribute or go through and refurbish how the ship's engines and exhausts are going to be at. Because they have been centerline before, so at the center of the ship. When they're putting on the flight deck, they actually have to move the funnels so that they're emptying out on the right-hand side of the ship, so that it doesn't obscure the flight deck as they go through. Now these naval acquisition bills have been going through since about 1940 and early 1941, so before the United States had actually gotten officially involved in the war, the War Department is making orders for the new warships so that they will be built within the next few years with the hope that they will be ready when war breaks out. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, pushes that timetable forward. One of the things that ends up happening is that the U.S. Pacific Fleet, okay, the battleships that were the core of it, most of them are damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor. The lucky thing was that none of the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were in port at the time. They were out in operations instead. What they were doing was they were ferrying aircraft to other U.S. bases in the Pacific. So that when the Japanese came and attacked, yes, they took out the battleships, but the aircraft carriers were still around for the U.S. to be able to strike with. This is actually one of the shipyards, okay, in Oregon. Okay, these are the aircraft carriers that are being worked on. Okay, in order for them to be completed and launched as quickly as possible. But again, you have this huge expansion, building expansion of all these things. But you still have to train all the crews. You still have to get everybody up to speed with what they're going to do. And again, naval aviation is not just necessary in the Pacific theater of operations. It's important in the Atlantic theater of operations to fight against the Germans and Italians at the same time. The U.S. is spread over two different oceans, okay? And it's responsible for protecting both of them. And so what ends up happening is there's this massive fast forward on shipbuilding, and then also a fast forwarding on training in order to get these pilots up to speed. But this is just one shift of workers, okay, going in order to put these ships together. And again, okay, these are not steel decks. Okay, these are timber decks, so they're actually going into kind of the Pacific rainforests in Oregon and Washington and cutting those down and then using that as the planking for these ships. Another thing that becomes a major priority, again, to get these carriers up and running, to have the crews trained as soon as the ships are ready to go. The Japanese don't just attack the United States, they also attack our allies in the Pacific as well. The British had a small, what they call their Eastern Fleet, that was operating out of India or Singapore. And what ends up happening is shortly after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese start attacking British and Dutch and Australian bases. And they end up catching one of these British forces without an aircraft carrier to protect it. A battleship called the Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse, both relatively modernized ships. It was thought that because they were surface warships, they'd be able to protect the area. Ends up happening is Japanese aircraft operating out of Indochina, what today is Vietnam, sink these ships within about an hour and a half of spotting them. They wiped this task force out. The British, after that, they end up organizing another small group, and they actually have an aircraft carrier in that. Okay, it's the HMS Hermes, which unfortunately is this guy right here. That task force is hunted down and destroyed by the Japanese Navy. And the same aircraft carriers that hit Pearl Harbor, after they were done bombing that, they moved west across the Pacific to hit different targets in order to support their invasions in different spots. And 4 of those aircraft carriers go through and wipe out the Hermes-centered battle group by mid-1942. And at that point, it's really just the United States, the Australian Navy that are holding the Japanese back. One of the things that ends up happening with naval aviation is it's incredibly dangerous. Any aviation training is going to be difficult, but taking off from stationary land air bases is going to be infinitely easier. Some of the things that happen with aircraft carriers is that they don't have catapults in order to aid these aircraft taking off. What they have to do is they have to have a sufficiently long flight deck in order to give those planes the chance to power up as you're getting ready to take off. And usually these aircraft carriers have to turn into the wind, meaning the wind has to be behind them to also give those planes lift as they go through. And a lot of times, even the best trained pilots, something can go wrong. They either don't have enough power or the wind hits them wrong. One of the worst things that can end up happening for them is that as they're taking off, they don't have enough power to climb, and then they end up crashing into the water in front of the aircraft carrier, and it just keeps moving. So there's not always a chance to recover these people. But that's one of the things, is that now, in order to supplement, and put in these new pilots and flight crews, there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands of them every year that need to be trained somewhere. And again, the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans are not good places to train because those ships would be vulnerable to submarine attack. And so that's why they decide that the Great Lakes seem like a good thing to do. Now this is going to be the Battle of Midway. This is one of the turning points in the Pacific War. The United States ends up putting together a 3-carrier strike group and ends up winning a major victory against the Japanese in June of 1942. Sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers for the loss of 1 of ours. But now there's only a couple of American aircraft carriers operating in the Pacific Ocean. You have Essex-class ships that are going to be coming online in early or mid-1943. So the few aircraft carriers the U.S. Navy does have, they cannot be in port. They cannot be used for training. It's just that would cripple the U.S. abilities to counter what the Japanese are able to do. Another part of it is, too, is that because the training is incredibly dangerous, and the fact that most of these aircraft carriers are operating with a wooden flight deck, is that if you do have training accidents, a plane crashes onto the deck, if it's loaded with fuel, it has a chance of starting a fire that's going to burn through the deck, and maybe get into the magazines. And so the idea of using something that should be a frontline ship for training is out of the question. And what happens in late December 1941, again, the U.S. Navy has been looking for ships in order to buy, in order to convert. And what happens is they pick up 2 of them. The Great Buffalo, which is operating out of Detroit. Its cruise line usually went from Detroit to Buffalo to Niagara Falls, and then come back, go to Mackinac, and go to Illinois. The second ship is the C&V. This one was operating out of Sandusky, Ohio. And then eventually, these both are going to end up in Chicago. Okay, so that's Chicago skyline. This is in late 1943, so this is after the ships have been converted over. They don't have a hangar bay, meaning that they can't store aircraft internally. Okay, so all the aircraft that are going to operate off these ships are sitting on the flight deck. Okay, so that limits the number that they can have on there. Also, the flight deck for both of these ships is only about 2/3 the size, okay, of a regular flight deck, so they kind of gives the pilots a little bit more confidence after they get done training, because they're able to basically short takeoff and land compared to other places. But this is the Chicago Naval Dock, Navy Pier. This is where they would load up, okay, with their sailors and air crew, okay, and then they go out into the Great Lakes. And as long as the conditions in Lake Michigan were fairly decent, they had to have the wind. Okay, there had to be a steady flow of wind in there in order for those training planes to be able to take off successfully and not crash into the water. If it was a calm day where there was no weather whatsoever, no wind or anything, they wouldn't go out to train them, because they needed that as a way to do it. The nice thing with Lake Michigan too is that it's far enough away from any avenue of attack by the access. There's no way that any airplanes or submarines are going to be able to get into the Great Lakes and attack them while they're operating in there. And Lake Michigan's weather sometimes can be pretty rough. And so it simulates what the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean conditions will be like. So these pilots are learning how to take off and land on a ship that's rolling and moving. So it gives them the opportunity to actually get as close to realistic conditions as possible when they go into combat. Now the Buffalo, again, it starts out as this passenger liner, and it is one of the biggest ones operating in the Great Lakes. It can have a passenger group of about 1,500 when it's fully loaded. So that's pretty enormous. Had a crew of 300 when it goes through. It's built in 1924, and the interesting thing with it is that it's a side wheel excursion, okay, meaning that there's side wheel propellers on either side of the mid part of the ship. That's its propulsion. And that's one of the things that the Navy kind of liked about this, is the fact that, okay, even though it's not a perfect replica of what an aircraft carrier is going to be, it at least has speed characteristics close to what they will have. Okay. Well, the Greater Buffalo had a sister ship called the Greater Detroit. Okay. The Navy doesn't requisition that one. Instead, it stays with its parent company. And the interesting thing is with it, it's 650 staterooms. Okay, 1,500 passengers can go on the ship when it was as a tour ship as you go through. You can go to Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, Niagara Falls, Mackinac Island, Chicago, and it was a $3 trip. But back in the 20s and 30s, $3 was still pretty expensive to go through. But it was designed along the ideas of almost like an oceanic liner. Okay, it had the staterooms for people to stay in. It also had a couple different bars, so that you could eat and drink as you go in there. It had areas that you could go in and basically kind of watch as you're going through there. Now the second aircraft carrier, converted ship, is actually an older one, okay, where you have the Greater Buffalo that's built in 1924. The C&D is built in 1912. Again, as an excursion liner, okay, and this is the ship itself, okay, next to its pier, so this is where it would load on its passengers. Okay, this one operated between Cleveland, or out of the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company, and again, it's not a merchant ship, so it's not moving cargo like copper or iron or wood. It's something that would just be a giant cruise ship, okay, for Michigan. Now this, okay, is what it looked like in 1919. This is one that's taken over by the US Navy. Okay. And it's too big to go into any of the dry docks that are any of the kind of stations that you would put a ship into in order to do heavy manufacturing or conversion with. So it's actually sitting in the water while the workers are converting it from this passenger liner to an aircraft carrier. Okay, and it takes from January 1942 until about January 1943 for the conversion to be done. And usually, again, with the C&D, when it was a commercial liner, it goes from Cleveland to Buffalo. It had 510 staterooms, again, 1,500 persons. If it absolutely had to, it could carry up to 6,000 people. So again, this is one of the biggest of these ships. As you go through it, in this case, okay, this is another one of the posters. It's going to tell you, okay, sailing daily, okay, $4.63 for the trip. Okay, again, for the 1930s, it's pretty expensive. And again, with this ship, when it starts out as a passenger liner, it is again built to kind of mimic, okay, the transoceanic liners that would be going across the Atlantic from Europe to the United States. Again, it has the bars, it has the restaurants that are in there, and all these things have to be torn out and rebuilt in order to make this thing an operational aircraft carrier. Now, when the Great Depression hits in 1929 through about 1935, these commercial cruising companies take a gigantic hit. It's incredibly expensive to fuel these ships and operate them. And what ends up happening between 1931 and 1935 is most of these ships end up getting pulled off of their routes and basically just sit and dock. And then in 1935 and 1936, the economy's recovered enough that they start taking these back out on limited cruises as you go through. And by the time we get to 1939, the United States Navy is starting to look at these ships, these types of ships, for them to take over as auxiliary ships. A passenger liner that might operate in the Great Lakes has the potential to be a few different things for the Navy. It could be a troop transport. Okay, so soldiers or Marines or airmen that have to go from the United States to military bases overseas. If the passenger liners are fast enough, they can be used to move those people from the United States to wherever they need to go. Or in this case, they can be used for training ships, and that's what is going to end up happening. One of the big things that the U.S. Navy is very interested in, starting in 1939, is when the British are trying to get supplies for North America. Instead of having merchant ships operating independently, moving on their own from one port to the next, they organize into convoys. So you have groups of anywhere between 10 and 50 or 60 merchant ships in one group protected by warships. One of the things that was needed were these smaller aircraft carriers to help provide air cover against German air attack or submarine attack. Okay. Those cruise ships, if bought and converted, those can also potentially serve as escort ships for these convoys, freeing up larger ships to actually conduct operations against enemy forces. So this is the Sable. And she's just about completely converted. Okay, and then this is her sister ship, still as a passenger liner. So you can see how much of the upper decks they actually had to take off, dismantle, to get it from this frame to this. And you can see, I can't really see in this picture, but the funnels originally would have been in the center line about here of the ship. And you can see that they've been pushed over, redistributed, so they are on the starboard side of the ship. These converted aircraft carriers also do not have any weapons on them. Okay, so there are no anti-aircraft weapons for the gun crews to train on how to protect these aircraft. That's going to be a different ship they operate that out of. But they basically have to go through, and kind of the cool thing with this is that instead of going with a wooden deck, what the Sable ends up doing when the Navy gets them is they put a metal deck on instead. And that allows for this, auxiliary ship, this converted aircraft carrier, to kind of be an experimental bed for new types of aircraft tires or braking systems. It's a way for them to kind of see what they can push in terms of technology. And so what ends up happening is after these ships are converted, and they're not converted in Chicago, instead they're either converted in New York or in Ohio, and then once the conversion is done, they're sent into Lake Michigan, and then their home base that they're going to operate out of is Chicago, Illinois, with the Naval Station Great Lakes, which is right in Lake Michigan, just outside, now inside the city of Chicago. This is a picture from the 40s of one of the main administration buildings for it. And then these are civilian volunteers coming in, and either they're going to be part of the Navy or they're going to join the Merchant Marine, so to run the convoy ships as they go through. Again, there's really no dry docks that are big enough in Chicago or in Lake Michigan if these ships got damaged, so they operate off that naval pier. And what will happen is that you're going to have the pilots, you will have their flight crews, so you'll have the ones who are arming them, who are basically going through refueling them, doing the maintenance on them. They're going to be on these ships so that they get first-hand experience of what it's like to actually operate in these areas. And then if they need more specialized training, after they get certified here, they move to a different base before they're assigned. And so this is, again, just a picture of them basically being put together. This is just, as they're getting ready to be finished with the conversion and sent into Lake Michigan. So this is January 15th, 1943. They're putting the finishing touches, onto the flight decks. And you have to put the flight deck on. You have to put arrestor cables, which are basically wire cables that are going to help stop the aircraft when they land. There's a hook that's on after the back end, the last wheel on the aircraft. The pilot would land, and then hook one of these arrestor cables, and usually there's 3 or 4 of them, lined up at different parts of the flight deck to stop them. Otherwise, they have to power up and try to basically maintain their altitude if they miss the arrestor wires. The bridges, and those new funnels had to be put in. Because they have the luxury liners, there's really not the internal space underneath the flight deck for an aircraft hangar, which is where you do the maintenance on most of these airplanes. If they're not being used for strikes, they're in the hangar deck, and that's where the flight crews are basically making sure the engines, the fuel lines, everything is working the way that they should be before they go into strike. So for Sable and Wolverine, since they don't have that hangar, everything has to be done on this flight deck, all the maintenance. And just to kind of show you that, even fully trained pilots sometimes, wipe out. They make mistakes as they come in. They run out of fuel, or they're going too fast, they miss the arrestor cable. Planes get damaged quite a bit, and if they're damaged too heavily, what will happen is they're basically kind of salvaged to see what can be taken off of them in terms of spare parts, and then whatever they can't salvage is tossed over the side as you go through. But again, even fully trained pilots, landing on these aircraft carriers is incredibly difficult. You could be coming in and it looks like it's a perfectly fine opportunity to land. Waves at the ship, or the wind shifts and starts pushing you off course as you're getting ready to come in. So you can miss the arrestor cables, the thing that's going to stop you. You can have an arrestor cable break so that it doesn't stop you. Usually there's a net that is put across the flight deck in order to stop the plane from completely shooting off. But the plane can land like this, where it does a belly landing and just kind of scrapes along the flight deck, or more catastrophically, it can hit the flight deck and then burst into flames. And then the flight crews, the guys who are on the flight deck to help the pilots, have to run out there and pull them out before they burn to death. So having the training, okay, both for the pilots and the people who are on the ship to maintain them and help them is vitally important as they go through. And if carriers are damaged, okay, by one of the planes that ends up crashing, that takes out that entire wing of fighters or bombers from that battle zone if the damage is too much. And since it's the Great Lakes, it's this inland waterway, there's not necessarily going to be a lot of enemy attacks on this. It's decided by the U.S. Navy when they're converting these ships over that putting weapons on them, putting anti-aircraft weapons on them, is not going to be something that's profitable for them. So instead, it's just basically for naval aviation and flight crew training. What will end up happening is that there is another ship, another civilian ship, the Willamette, that is bought by the U.S. Navy, and then that is converted into the ship where they're going to do gunnery training. So anybody who would operate anti-aircraft guns, so like some of the guns that you'll see in the museum, like the 50 caliber machine gun, a 20 millimeter cannon, there's a 40 millimeter cannon that's used for anti-aircraft operations. Those are going to be put onto this ship after it's bought. It's also going to have 2 anti-surface guns, 4-inch guns, which would look like this. These are designed basically to fight off surface enemy submarines. So in the Atlantic environment, we're going to attack with U-boats. They can either attack underwater or on the surface at night. These guns were designed to fight those U-boats if they surface. So some of the people who are going to go in there, everybody who's going to be on board a ship, who's going to be a gunner's mate, has to train on this ship. And then there's also what would be called the Army Guard and Merchant Marine, which is, they're civilians, but they're the ones who are going to run merchant ships, so the ones that operate the freighters and the oilers that move between North America and Europe or Pacific Islands. There is a group that is with them that are called the Army Guard. They're the ones who are trained on how to operate the anti-aircraft, anti-surface guns. They're also the ones who are trained on how to use the radios in order if they need to call for aid, or if they need to send out an SOS, or if they need to coordinate between the ships. My grandfather was actually in the Army Guard and Merchant Marine. So he ran at least 11 convoys in the Atlantic. He was also in the Mediterranean Sea. He was in the Pacific Ocean, in the Indian Ocean. He signed up in 41 and went all the way through 1945. So it's kind of interesting it was very interesting to hear everything that he had to say, because when they actually got done with these cargo runs, while the ships were being unloaded, in some cases they were going to go through and tour some of the places, some of the locations they were at. So he's actually in Sicily, and he went through the catacombs that were in there. Fortunately, one of my aunts ended up taking all his pictures and service records, and she wouldn't share. So unfortunately, we didn't get a lot out of there. But what ends up happening is that with the Willamette, you have thousands of sailors and armed guards who end up going to this Great Lakes Naval Station to train on this, and then they're sent to the war fronts after it's done. And by the time the Wolverine and Sable are converted and fully operational, which is in 1943, you also have the Essex-class carriers, the Independence-class carriers, and some of the escort-class carriers coming online. And so what's kind of nice for all of them is as you go through the training for these pilots, their ships are starting to be commissioned and sent out for training. And the pilots and the flight crews are training in Lake Michigan, and when they get done, the ships should be, in theory, fully operational and ready to go out and fight in the combat zones. So these are just different classes of aircraft carriers that the U.S. Navy will operate during World War II. The Saratoga class Those were the battle cruisers from the First World War that were converted over. The Enterprise, this is going to be the class that has obviously the USS Enterprise, but also the Hornet, the Wasp, and the Yorktown. You have the Ranger class. You have the Essex class. Okay, so this is the big class that's being built in the Second World War. Okay, and they're being mass produced. And at the very end of the war, just as it's ending, okay, you have this class of 3 aircraft carriers called the Midway class that come online, but they do not participate in the war because by the time they're fully operational, the crews are trained, the war is over. But we end up keeping them. You have, okay, those light carriers, okay, the Independence class, okay, is the biggest group of them. Okay, and then the Saipan class is going to be a improvement on the Independence. And then all these little guys at the bottom, these are the escort carriers, okay, the ones who are going to be part of convoys, or they're going to be providing close support for amphibious invasions. And so all of these ships, including the ones that are already in operation, they're going to need new flight crews, new pilots as time goes on. And so as each of these ships starts to come online, it's commissioned, the training is done, once those pilots are through, okay, in the Great Lakes, okay, they're sent to whatever station they need to go. Now, by the time we get to 1945, okay, Sable and Wolverine operate in the Great Lakes for 2 years. You have only about 200 accidents, okay, that take place, okay, taking off and landing. 128 planes are completely destroyed. Out of that whole group, only 8 pilots are killed in the process of this. Okay, you have between 17,000 and 35,000 pilots and aircrew being trained off of these ships. Okay, so out of that whole group, only 200 accidents take place. Okay, one of the pilots, okay, who was trained there, was former President, okay, George H.W. Bush. Okay, he trained as a torpedo bomber. Okay, and then that, okay, was his plane's name, Barbara, named after his, at this point, it's his girlfriend. It's not, she's not a wife yet. Okay. By the time it's done, there are 116,000 landings in those couple years. And again, it has to be very particular weather conditions in order for these to end up taking place. Again, this is where the planes will be coming into land at the back of the flight deck. This is where they're also going to have to start, okay, moving to take off. Okay. And the Great Lakes provided an excellent proxy, okay, for the Atlantic and the Pacific. Again, because the weather conditions could change so quickly. It gave them the confidence to be able to operate in any of these theaters. And because these 2 ships were so much shorter in terms of their flight deck than what they would be operating on in the combat zone, they felt a lot more confident when it came to actually having fully armed and fueled aircraft when we were taking off. Now, what ends up happening by the time we get to 1945 is that the United States Navy has expanded tremendously. Okay, there have been hundreds of warships that have been completed. You have something around the lines of over 100 different aircraft carriers between the Essex class, the light carriers, and then all of those escort carriers. So there's an overabundance of these ships. Same thing with battleships, and cruisers, and destroyers. And by the time we get to August 1945, the United States drops the 2 atomic bombs in Japan, and they end up surrendering. By the time you get to November 1945, the war is completely done, and there is the call for basically kind of disarming the United States. There's not the need for so many of these weapons. And what ends up happening is the Sable and Wolverine, okay, they end up getting struck from the Navy's roster in November 1945. So they're really only operational in the Navy for about 3 years. And then because you have this surplus of so many other purpose-built aircraft carriers that can now be used for training, the United States Navy decides it's not economically feasible to keep these around. So what happens is that they get decommissioned, and then by 1947, both of them are sold for scrap. Okay, so neither one of these ships still exists. Within a couple years of the Navy being done with them, they're sold off and then torn down for scrap metal, which is unfortunate. And again, you know, because there's so many of these Essex-class and Defense-class ships, a lot of the pre-war ones are just basically taken out of rotation. But the Great Lakes serve as an excellent example for training, because again, it is such a confined area and so well protected because it's in the interior of the eastern United States. Nothing could really get to these ships. The only thing that could damage them were unfortunately the pilots who were training them. And that's where we kind of end with this. This is just kind of a quick, brief little introduction to it. And then if you have questions about that, obviously open for that.
Yeah. What class would these be comparable to?
They would be comparable. Let me put that a couple slides. They're going to be a little bit shorter than those Independence class. Okay, so this thing right here. Okay, they're only about 3/4 that size. Okay, the Independence class, they're purposely designed as light aircraft carriers, so they actually do have the hangar underneath the flight deck. The Saipan class is another one of these ships that is an improved version of this. So it's a bit longer, the hangar is larger, the carrying capacity for them is better. When we get to like this Coage class and the Casablanca class, they're along the lines of how the Wolverine and Sable don't have hangar bays. So they're aircraft that basically exposed to weather and sea conditions as we go in there. And then like these Essex class carriers, once they come online, the United States will continue operating these in Vietnam. Some of them are converted so that they have additional angled flight decks so that it's easier to operate jet powered aircraft. So there's a place where they can land, a place where they recover them. The Enterprise and Ranger, those older pre-war ships, for the most part, these guys are going to be decommissioned and not kept by the Navy. Saratoga, unfortunately, that was used as a target for Bikini Atoll. You know, we're testing the atomic bomb to see what would happen to warships. She's one of the test ships. It's kind of cool if you guys, have you ever heard of Gary, or Robert Ballard, the guy who found the Titanic? He was hired by the U.S. Navy around the same time to go into the Pacific and find where a lot of these famous shipwrecks were at. And so the same submarines that he used to find the Titanic, he went in to find Saratoga and Bikini Atoll ships. And these ships had planes, they had fuel, they had weapons on board to see what the atomic bombs would do to live ammunition. So like, it is an area that is highly restricted in terms of tourist diving because there's still live ordnance there as we go through. The Midway class, the last one of those I think that was decommissioned was in the early 80s or mid-1980s as nuclear-powered aircraft carriers became more prevalent in the United States Navy starting in the 60s. The older classes like the Essex and the Midway were slowly phased out of operation.
So the training that was done in the Great Lakes, that's no longer being done in the Great Lakes? Is there training being done in the ocean?
Yeah, nowadays it's more in the oceans because you know, these prop planes that you'd have in the Second World War, most of them, their maximum speed is no more than 400 miles per hour, if that. With modern jet aircraft, the carrier sizes have increased significantly. And so what ends up happening is that there are aircraft carriers, if they're not on rotation in combat zone, they train the pilots that are there. Because those planes, since they are jets, they're so much faster, it's safer to have them operate in the ocean if there's an accident than if it's in the Great Lakes where you can have more infrastructure built around it. The concept of having large aircraft carriers the smaller aircraft carriers kind of stick around even today. So you'll see like the United States operates the nuclear class carriers, the Nimitz and Ford class. Those are our mainstay aircraft carriers right now. But there are smaller aircraft carriers that will support the Marines, where they have helicopters, where they have short takeoff and landing aircraft. So the idea of having big ships and smaller aircraft carriers to operate either together or independently, that sticks around after the Second World War.
How did you get interested in all of this?
That would be family, my family. My grandfather on the mother's side, again, was in the British Marine. So the Second World War, he ended up basically doing the convoy runs to different areas. My father's side of the family, they were from Hungary, and so they had been occupied by the Germans. First, kind of forced into an alliance with Germany, and then occupied in 1944. And when the war was over, they came over as displaced persons, because Hungary was taken over by the Soviet Union, and they did not want to be communist. And so they came to the United States instead. So just hearing the family stories from the different sides of it, starting out at about 8 years old, and going from there all the way to now, getting my undergraduate and graduate degrees at Central Michigan University, and starting to work for them. It was kind of nice.
Yeah, one comment. If I'm not mistaken, they salvaged one of the airplanes that was used for training from these carriers, I think it was Lake Michigan or so. And I think maybe, I'm not sure whether it was this particular plane or maybe another one, they found that, I think it was the Doubtless dive bomb, and took part in the Battle of Midway.
Nice.
So at least one of the planes have been salvaged, and I think it's at a museum someplace.
All right, I'll have to take a look into that.
It's at the Air Zoo
Air Zoo?
in Kalamazoo.
Yeah, all right, definitely have to take a look at that one. That would be fascinating to see.
So they used some of the older planes that were first used in the Pacific, and then they brought them and recycled them to be trained planes on, I guess, on these auxiliary carriers here.
Nice, yeah, because it would be, the fighter would be the older fighters, the F4F Wildcat, and then it went to the F6F Hellcat.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that makes sense.
So, like I said, if I'm not mistaken, there is at least one in Doubtless. I'm not certain whether it was this particular aircraft that that was salvaged. That was, like I said, it took part in the Battle of Midway. So,
I'll have to take a look into that. Another really interesting, oh, there we go.
Available in the gift shop.
Yes. What can I say? Chris knows what he's doing. He's got the
speaking of the devil.
Yes. Another interesting thing that was going on with the Great Lakes too is that by Traverse City, there was an Army air base that was working with the U.S. Navy, and they were towards the end of 1944, early 1945. They were working, trying to do radio-controlled drone planes, and those occasionally crash into Grand Traverse Bay, and then people would call the local sheriff or local police and say, "Hey, well, there's a plane that crashed. You might want to send somebody up to pick the pilot up." And they, just told them, "Don't worry about it." I had a friend who that was his specialty when he was doing his graduate degree was the air operations around Grand Traverse Bay. That was a pretty cool one. So that's kind of the nice thing is that when you're in grad school, you find people who just have that little thing and you're like, okay, I want to know more about this, but I'm buried in my own.
Apparently, the Great Lakes have a pretty active military history from the Revolutionary War until maybe to the present. So
big city, the shipyards there, they churned out a lot of smaller warships and landing craft, just because they already had the maritime infrastructure there, and so they just converted over and started going through. And then Chicago is also another huge port city, Gary, Indiana, Cleveland. So yeah, it's pretty amazing.
So there could be a lot of history down there in the water that we don't know about.
Oh yeah.
I think that there's even, Revolutionary War ships, small ones, that were sunk. I think they were American, and they were sunk by the British or sunk in a battle, I think. And it's still down there pretty much reasonably intact. So I think it's two of them. So I think it's Lake Erie or somewhere in there.
Yeah. Underwater archaeology is a good thing when it comes to the Great Lakes, because you don't disintegrate too much compared to.
Well, in reality, you don't think of the Great Lakes as being any sort of military history. Now you're finding out that there's all sorts of stuff down there. So.
Yeah, especially, Revolutionary War and War of 1812, where the US.
Airplane from Val Midway maybe. So.
Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty cool. So yeah, hopefully we get a lot more. It'd be nice to get some more funding in order to be able to go through it, do more of the research. Any more questions or?
Is that a book you wrote?
No. Nope. This is.
That was one of the presentations.
Yeah, so if anybody is interested, this was we've covered, I think we've had this topic a few times, but this was a speaker that was here a couple of years ago in the before times, and he wrote a book about the aircraft that are recovered from the Great Lakes. He's actually one of the marine archaeologists who's actually pulling them up. They've recovered a number of them. Unfortunately, the zebra mussels are destroying what's left. So the clock is ticking. They don't know how many more they can pull up because the zebra mussels are pretty much destroying anything that's down there.
Yeah.
So a lot of those great War of 1812 and Rev War stuff you're talking about, the zebra mussels are just devastating.
Invasive species.
So, but we do have copies of this book available out there if you want to get one.
So what he's telling you is, take a look and maybe buy one.
Oh, and I forgot too, is the used book sale is still up, so please go visit it.
Well, thank you everybody for coming and listening and having your questions. If you do have, any questions or comments or anything, we have a little flyer for our organization, Mr. Szilagyi. We do, we do twice a week podcasts about different subjects, almost any subjects on history. So if it's something you want to learn about, shoot us an email and we'll see what we can dig up on it. But with that, everybody have a good day. Hopefully this is not the last nice one before winter.
Thank you.